When you look at the whole picture and you can do these morbid calculations about the fatality rates of nuclear power, you find that nuclear is actually as safe as wind and solar. The radiation dose in Cornwall is 2.5, 3 times what you would get in other parts of the UK, and there's absolutely no correlation between background radiation and increased cancer incidence. By essentially mining, by chemically prying the americium from legacy nuclear waste, you could repurpose that material and fly it in space one day, not just for pure exploration purposes for the outer solar system, but also powering habitats on the surface of the moon and perhaps even Mars.
Hello and welcome to Free the Power, the IEA's occasional series looking at free market solutions to energy and environment challenges. Today I'm joined by author, nuclear scientist and employee at Sellafield, Tim Gregory, who's written a fantastic new book, Going Nuclear, How the Atom Will Save the World. Tim, you're very welcome.
Thank you for the invitation.
So tell us a little bit about your background.
So I work at Sellafield in a lab. I'm a chemist and I measure all sorts of interesting materials, most of which are radioactive, given the nature of the job, and they range from the kinds of materials that we put into and pull out of nuclear reactors. Sometimes I work on nuclear medicines and advanced cures and diagnostic tools for cancer. Sometimes I work and dabble in the space industry as well, looking at the future of how we power spacecraft on the moon and Mars and in the outer solar system using radioactive power sources. And so I'm lucky as an analyst that I kind of get to tap into the kind of the full remit of what nuclear science has to offer society. So that's my day job. And then my night job and weekend job is as a writer, which is how I wrote my new book.
It's a great book. I mean, I did GCSE physics,
right,
which is a very rudimentary level of knowledge compared to where you are at. And I found the explanation of how nuclear reactions work at the start of that book. And then throughout the book, all of the explanations of the science and how it interacts with the real world to be really simple and easy to understand.
Oh, good.
So I recommend this book to everybody.
Good. I thought it was important, if you're advocating for some new technology to kind of expand and be a big part of society, people should at least have some understanding of how it works. And so I kind of, I'm glad that I could indulge in a bit of that.
So I'm going to delve into bits of the book, and I think I'll probably start with the elephant in the room, which is what you describe as radiophobia.
Right.
And the fear of nuclear power, radiation, and all the things associated with the industry, including things people don't even realise are associated with it, which you've just mentioned a few. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah, so radiation, I mean, just the word conjures kind of suspense and fear, and a large part of that is because of popular culture and the motifs that you see in the movies, comic books, TV shows, computer games. The message is reinforced constantly in popular culture that radiation is bad news. But actually, when you look at the data, you need to be exposed to an awful lot of radiation, like an incredibly unusual and large amount of radiation for it to have any sort of negative health impact. And so when it comes to nuclear power, one of the kind of oppositions that's frequently touted to having a nuclear power station down the road or something, which is what I advocate for in Going Nuclear, is the exposure to radiation. You know, doesn't it cause cancer, birth defects, glow-in-the-dark monsters, all that kind of thing? And when you take a sober look at the data, you realise that the amount of radiation that's put out into the environment from the nuclear power industry is absolutely negligible. It's in the noise of what you would receive naturally from background radiation, mostly from the rocks beneath our feet, with radon gas that seeps naturally from the ground, and cosmic rays that come from space. So the amount of radiation that we're exposed to from nuclear power is absolutely negligible.
And you use a really interesting example towards the end of the book around the Fukushima disaster, and highlighting the way that they've had to clean that up and what they decided to release into the environment, and that being actually a lot less than people would be exposed to in background radiation.
Yes, for sure. So the Fukushima water that just a couple of years ago the Japanese started releasing into the ocean from the cleanup after the nuclear accident at Fukushima, there was so much hysteria in the media at the time about this radioactive water, because it sounds really bad, doesn't it? Like putting radioactive water into the sea. It's like, oh my goodness, that sounds terrible. Like not just for human health, but for the environment as well. But when you look at the data, you realise that the amount of radiation in that water is 6 times lower than the World Health Organization limit for safe drinking water. And so what was effectively being put into the ocean was drinking water. albeit from an industrial plant.
I mean, this goes back decades, doesn't it? I mean, the Perrier mineral water company had a radiation contamination scandal, I think, back in the 90s.
Right. Yeah.
And that forced them to shut down an entire production line for a significant period of time. But I strongly suspect that the level of contamination would have been remarkably similar.
It was probably, it was. I don't know the statistics for that particular case, but it's probably barely anything, actually. And there's, even within the UK, there's a lot of variation in background radiation, famously in Cornwall, because of the granite, which is quite uranium rich compared to your average rock that you would find in the ground. And the radiation dose in Cornwall is 2.5-3 times what you would get in other parts of the UK. And there's absolutely no correlation between background radiation and increased cancer incidence. Another example is Colorado. It's got very uranium-rich bedrock, and it's very high in altitude sense, I should say. It's very high up, so they get a lot of cosmic radiation. And again, they've actually got less than the US average for cancer incidence. And so background radiation is absolutely nothing to worry about. And almost all of our unnatural exposure to radiation is far below even that.
And you cited, I think it was Iran, as being had a location that was the most exposed place of the world, but still safe. Yeah,
there are some particular locations in the earth. So there are some very thorium-rich beaches in India. There's some very thorium and uranium-rich parts of Iran, and the background radiation is actually like significantly higher than even Cornwall or Colorado or Finland. And again, there's no convincing excess in any radiation-related illnesses from these parts of the world.
I mean, working in nuclear in Iran is unsafe, but for a very different reason. But we won't go into that.
No, not today.
So there is an unreasonable fear of radiation across the world amongst the general public. Are there any parts of the world where that's not true?
Yes, where I live and work in Congress. Okay. Yeah. So I work at Sellafield, which employs more than 10,000 people. And then there are the kind of peripheral companies as well that support the work that we're doing at Sellafield. And it's very interesting. Most people in my local area work at Sellafield. In fact, I work with people who are third generation Sellafield workers. Mm-hmm. And no one is worried about radiation there. I mean, it's part of our day job. We take all the precautions. We're constantly frisking ourselves with radiation probes, as you could imagine. There's a lot of procedural and health and safety hoops to jump through, and fair enough. But it's interesting in the circles that I work in and often socialise in. It's the people who work with radiation the most who are the least afraid of it. And so I guess in that sense, it's exposure therapy.
And the water outlet from Sellafield, you go swimming there regularly?
Yeah, for sure. We discharge some, we call it aqueous waste, into the Irish Sea that contains radioactivity from Sellafield. And again, when you look at the data, it's barely anything. And as you can imagine, this has been studied to death over decadal time periods now. There are beach surveys, there are environmental health assessments, there are human health assessments of the impact of that radiation. And it's like way down in the decimals for the amount of radiation that you're exposed to. And so I go swimming. When I can brave the cold water in the Irish Sea, I go swimming off the coast of Sellafield all the time.
Fantastic. So civil uses of nuclear materials can and are safe?
Yes.
Okay. So why don't we have a much bigger nuclear industry as a result?
It's a good question. When I kind of go out and talk to people, and people who've read my book, and when I go out on speaking engagements, one of the things that always comes up is Chernobyl. It's kind of fresh in the mind of a lot of people who are in positions of making decisions, basically, about energy policy and where it's all going. I don't have that trauma because I was born in the early 90s. I don't remember Chernobyl. It was like before my time, but there's still that kind of lingering, and I guess this is adjacent and linked with the radiophobia question. There's this perception that nuclear is unsafe, mm-hmm. and it's because of accidents like 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and more recently Fukushima. It's really interesting when you look at the data from those accidents. Nobody died at 3 Mile Island. Nobody was even exposed to anything above background radiation. And so mm-hmm. There's nothing really to talk about when it comes to 3 Mile Island. But it is interesting that the US built more nuclear reactors in the 5 years leading up to 3 Mile Island than it has built since. And this happened in the late 70s. It's been a long time. And similarly with Chernobyl, Europe built more nuclear reactors in the 5 years leading up to Chernobyl than it has built since. So it's really no kind of exaggeration to say that it was 3 Mile Island that put an end to nuclear power expansion in North America, and it was Chernobyl that put an end to nuclear power expansion in Europe. But when you step back and take a sober look at these accidents, and I'm always cautious not to kind of trivialize it away and be kind of blasé and flippant about it, because Chernobyl was avoidable ultimately, and every death from Chernobyl was avoidable and shouldn't have happened. So I don't want to diminish it and trivialize it. But when you look at the whole picture and you can do these morbid calculations about the fatality rates of nuclear power, you find that nuclear is actually as safe as wind and solar. When you look at the number of deaths per megawatt hour of electricity, the megawatt hour being the currency of energy, which is ultimately the whole point of this nuclear power, is to generate the energy that we need for society to function. It's actually as safe as wind and solar, and it's orders of magnitude safer than burning fossil fuels, mainly because of the air pollution that it puts in that we all breathe all the time. And so these calculations about fatality rate would have to be wrong by factors of hundreds or thousands for them to at least be on a par with fossil fuels. And so kind of contrary to the perception that's out there in the public and in popular culture that nuclear power is dangerous, splitting atoms is one of the safest things that our species does.
And one of the interesting other points you made about Fukushima was that the reaction to the disaster, moving people and the emergency response, actually killed far more people. Those who were at risk of any radiation.
I mean, Fukushima was pretty bad. Like it was a tsunami, one of the biggest tsunamis in historical records that hit the power station, and three of the reactors went into meltdown and exploded. It was really, really bad. But only one person died from radiation exposure. Even that death is contested, but in my book, I'm slightly conservative and granted, okay, one person died from the exposure. But you have to remember that at the same time, from the evacuations from the area surrounding Fukushima, Japan was dealing with the aftermath of a magnitude 9 earthquake as well, which obviously had something to do with it. But thousands of people died in the evacuation, mostly old people, because they were moved from care homes, from hospital, from their homes. The stress killed thousands of people, which is, again, orders of magnitude more people than died from the actual radiation. And the consensus out there is that the evacuation of the areas immediately surrounding Fukushima were probably justified in the immediate aftermath of the accident, because they didn't know what the consequences were going to be. But those people shouldn't have been displaced for months and years like they were, and a lot of those deaths would have been avoidable. And so again, this hysterical reaction to radiation exposure actually kills more people than radiation itself.
It brings to mind the debate about the lockdown being more dangerous than the pandemic. But anyway, we're going to that as a whole other topic. So reaction to high-profile disasters, the impact of which has been greatly overstated in the public imagination, is one reason why there was a fall in nuclear building. But the nuclear industry continued, but got a lot more expensive. Why was that?
That's a good question. A lot of people talk about overregulation of the nuclear power industry. I think looking at a bigger picture, though, in general, not just in the UK, but across Europe and North America as well, there's this kind of creeping drag in being able to build large pieces of infrastructure, whether we're talking about high-speed rail networks, perhaps motorways, new houses, hospitals, river crossings, tunnels underneath rivers, perhaps, the cost escalation and the timescales dragging out. Nuclear kind of gets caught up in that chronic inability to build large pieces of infrastructure, because it wasn't always this way. The median build time for a nuclear reactor in Europe, and that's from the start of construction to commercial operation, was 6 and a bit years. For decades. And in fact, some of the first power stations to be built in the UK, in fact, we had the first commercial nuclear power station in the UK. It was at Sellafield. It opened in the late 50s, Calder Hall. It was opened by Queen Elizabeth II. That was built in just a couple of years. And so it's not that the science and technology and the engineering is inherently slow and takes forever. It's just that we've kind of lost the knack of doing it.
Are you being too kind to successive governments there? So the infrastructure problem is real, but if we take a different energy industry like onshore drilling for oil and gas or fracking, this is not huge infrastructure. These are small industrial projects, and they couldn't do anything because they were over-regulated on safety grounds. And in that specific case, the focus of the over-regulation was the risks from tremors in the ground,
right,
which were regulated to a level which I believe was akin to a ladder falling over, while at the same time you're permitted to use pneumatic drills. with different regulations. And in nuclear's case, we looked a couple of weeks ago at ALARA and ALARP as being the source of overregulation worldwide through things like the no limits, or what's called no limits threshold.
The linear no threshold model.
Linear no threshold model.
Yes.
So that surely means that it's compounding what is a general systemic level of managed decline in infrastructure, specifically targeting the industry.
So the linear no threshold model is an interesting one. It states that if you plot, basically in essence, if you plot a graph of radiation exposure versus increased risk of cancer, it's a straight line that goes through the origin. And so the natural fallout of that is that there is no safe level of radiation. Every increment of radiation exposure, no matter how small, has a corresponding increase in the risk of cancer. That is the model on which pretty much the entire world bases its radiation protection regulations on. It doesn't have overwhelming scientific support. When I was researching this chapter of my book, trying to get my head around the linear no threshold model, because I was aware of it, I work under it, my job is regulated by it. I was reading some parts of the scientific literature that were presenting quite a strong case in favour of the linear no threshold model being real and an accurate representation of reality. Some of the papers were arguing fiercely against it, saying that these data, if you take them on aggregate, completely debunk the linear no threshold model. And there was a large bit of the literature in the middle that was kind of shrugging and said, well, we just don't know. It's inconclusive. And that's the take-home message that I had from the literature. The linear no threshold model, if it is real, is so noisy statistically at the low end of radiation exposures, the kinds of exposures that we get naturally and from working in the nuclear industry or having a nuclear power station down the road. It's so noisy and statistically uncertain that it's basically indistinguishable from background radiation. And so the fact that basically the entire world works under the premise that that model is true is probably over-conservative. Even if the linear no threshold model is true, and small increments of radiation exposure do increase your risk of getting cancer, those increases in fatalities are nothing compared to the increase in fatalities you get from burning fossil fuels, especially coal and oil, which put particulate matter into the air that we breathe. And you basically die from breathing dirty air, which is one of the biggest killers in the world. And it's a completely avoidable tragedy because we do have the means to generate that power and that heat without setting things on fire.
Yep.
It's splitting atoms. And so even if the linear no threshold model is true, by kind of setting all of our regulatory framework as if it is true is actually much better than the alternative, fossil fuels.
But okay, so that's a very fair point, and I think it's incontrovertible that, for example, the coal industry kills far more people than any other form of energy production.
Yeah, it's the deadliest form of energy. Yeah.
So if we wanted to get rid of coal entirely, and at the moment global use of coal is increasing, nuclear clearly presents one solution. But at current build rates and current costs, is that realistic?
No, not right now. There was this declaration a couple of years ago at COP in Dubai to triple the amount of nuclear power globally, which is actually in some sense huge. Actually, it was one of the biggest things to happen for the global nuclear power industry in decades, and there was huge celebration, and everyone was completely thrilled and chuffed to bits about it, me included, when they announced this, because oh my goodness, the most high-profile climate change conference in the world, a lot of influential people there. Now there's this group of 27 world leaders signing this declaration to triple the amount of nuclear power in the world. It's still not nearly enough. It's absolutely not enough. There's this really interesting relationship between energy consumption and GDP.
Yep.
You can almost use one as a proxy of the other. You can get a pretty good idea of the standard of living and the size of an economy in a country from the energy use per capita, and it's kind of a proxy for GDP. And I know that there would be people saying GDP isn't everything, and I agree, but it's a pretty good barometer of standards of living and social.
Generally said by people who don't have to worry about alternative.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And so the amount of energy that we need in the world, not just to maintain the living standards that we enjoy in the developed world, but to also get the developing world to enjoy the kind of living standards that we enjoy today, which I think is one of the things that we should be focusing on globally. this century requires enormous amounts of energy, and so tripling nuclear power is simply not enough. Although it's a good start, but
I think one of the interesting consequences, not necessarily just of that announcement, but also with the growing disappointment, I think, with the ability of renewables to deliver on their promise, has been the growth of a much more entrepreneurial set of small industries around nuclear. So the figure of 75 to 100 companies worldwide has been used, with people looking at different innovative new fourth and some are saying fifth generation models of nuclear power. And we had some people in here the other day who were talking about dual liquid technology.
Right.
So using an advanced form of liquid fuel and lead coolant to have much hotter reactors, which would then presumably be more efficient. Clearly, we don't know at the moment who's going to win these races. Are you excited about that growing industry?
Yes. So traditionally, nuclear reactors have been huge mega infrastructure, gigawatt scale projects, and the amount of capital you need to make that happen makes it very, very difficult for the private sector to kind of get a footing. It's really historically been state-run, and it's difficult to see how it could be anything other because of the billions and billions of pounds of capital you need for a single power station. These small modular reactors are really exciting, although I should urge caution. No one's actually achieved the dream of mass production, because the idea of these reactors, they're not just small, which we'll get onto, but they're modular. You can build them on a factory line. Like 80-90% of the reactor can be mass produced on a factory line and then clicked together like IKEA furniture where you want the reactor. Funnily, this isn't new technology, really, at least the small part. We've been putting nuclear reactors on submarines for decades, and many of the first nuclear reactors that were built in the 50s, when this was really getting started, would have fit under this desk quite easily. Small reactors have been around for a really, really long time. They've just never been deployed in a civil setting. The fact that they're small and you can mass produce them makes them cheaper.
Yeah.
This is where the private sector can get a foot in, because now you don't need £10 billion of capital to build a power station. You need a fraction of that. And so it's been really great to kind of see that, that kind of young, like Silicon Valley kind of like exciting, hip kind of startup culture. That's now in nuclear, which is really cool.
So that's interesting. So obviously Silicon Valley is in California.
Yes.
Where will, I don't know, Uranium Valley be?
It's a good question. I don't know. I guess we'll see. But there are these startups looking at different designs, and there are lots of ways that you can draw energy from uranium. You can use the lead-cooled reactors. There are molten salt reactors that rely on sodium. There are all sorts of different ways that you can do it, and exactly which design will win that kind of that Darwinian market selection is yet to be seen. Ultimately, I don't care. I just want lots of energy reliably. Without the environmental and human costs of fossil fuels. So we can talk about something else when we solve the energy problem. So it will be interesting to see over the next 10, 20 years what design and what companies will kind of win out in that.
Do you think we're going to build them here?
In the UK?
Yeah.
Yes. So the government has announced already that Rolls-Royce, although it's kind of like I don't know whether you'd call it a subsidiary or it's an entirely different company, but Rolls-Royce SMR will be building the first small modular reactors in the UK. And of course, they've got decades of expertise building the reactors for the UK's nuclear submarines. And so it's redeploying. And they're also building miniature reactors for the surface of the moon as well. There's an arm of Rolls-Royce that's doing that. And so they're very, very good at this. I hope that once this technology has been deployed and demonstrated and people realise, actually, it's not the end of the world having a nuclear power station down the road, we might open things up and have other companies doing it as well.
And you said one of the other advantages in the book of SMRs was that you could put them into factory complexes or industrial sites.
Yes.
To provide on-the-spot power and heat.
That's right. And the heat is crucial and often overlooked. When we talk about decarbonisation, we, fair enough, spend a lot of time talking about our electricity supply, which of course is clean at the point of use, but it's not clean if you generate it using fossil fuels. One of the other things that you get from splitting atoms is heat. In fact, heat is the primary form of energy that you get from splitting atoms, and we convert the heat into electricity. And right now, basically everywhere in the world, every single nuclear reactor, that heat goes to waste. It gets stripped out of the reactor through radiators and just dumped into the environment. It doesn't do anything. We could actually use that heat to drive industrial processes that require high temperatures. Ammonia synthesis that keep more than half of humanity alive with synthesizing fertilizer that we use to grow food. How about the steel industry? That requires a lot of heat. How about food and drinks factories? They require a lot of heat. How about the paper industry, which actually has a surprisingly large carbon footprint? How about we use the heat from these nuclear reactors to deliver the heat that industry needs? And that's where these small modular reactors, I think, will really, really shine, because I can see a future where you could fit a small modular reactor next to a factory or right in the middle of an industrial park to provide the heat that those industries need.
I mean, I agree with all this because I love the tech and I want it to happen here. But again, these chaps who are talking about their exciting new fifth generation technology will say, well, we're going to prototype this in Rwanda.
Right.
And the reason they're doing that is because Rwanda is borrowing its regulation from the people around the world who are doing this quickly, who can still build reactors in 6 to 8 years. Not in the UK. I mean, they've come to the UK because they want to raise money for the project. We're still a great financial centre. And when I was working in the German chemical industry back in the day, the CEO of that said he loved the UK. He said we have some of the world's best physicists, some of the world's best chemists, some of the world's best biologists. The problem is they're all working in the city.
Right.
And I'm not seeing anything yet changing in the UK that would actually make a difference.
I guess in a sense, someone's got to be first. And it's not just in Rwanda as well. So Bill Gates' company TerraPower, they're building a sodium-cooled reactor in Wyoming. There are a couple of these things dotted around the world. Maybe in the UK. I don't know. I guess time will tell. In a sense, although it would be nice if it were in the UK, being the home of commercial nuclear power back in the 50s, is where it all began. In a sense, if these things were prototyped and developed in other countries, there would be nothing stopping us deploying the real thing in the future. Although it would be nice from a
yeah, it doesn't have to be invented here. I mean, the Sizewell, I think you pointed out, obviously an example of French technology.
Sure, yeah,
being deployed in a British setting. But those are the projects that have had huge time and cost overruns.
They have, yeah.
And I think when I was looking at that originally 10 years ago, I was sort of very irritated that this amazing technology was so expensive and always broke its promises. But my sympathy for the industry has grown over time, because it seems to me that most of the problems are coming from unreasonable expectations of safety and over-engineering from the regulators, who don't see it as their job to build a commercial industry or a successful one, merely to regulate the hypothetical risks.
Right. And there's also an element of the last reactor that the UK connected to the grid was in 1995. Sizewell B.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't done this in a long time. Hinkley Point C, someone pointed out to me the other day that we basically started building that reactor from scratch. We didn't really have a civil nuclear industry when we started building that reactor. And so the hope is, and I guess time will tell, with Sizewell C, which is basically a cut and paste job from Hinkley Point C, all of the hard-won lessons and knowledge from building that reactor and from that power station, we can implement at Sizewell C. And I guess time will tell whether or not we'll build it on time within budget. But there's
so let's skip ahead to this future has been delivered. What are some of the exciting things that we could expect to see spinning out if we can get over this hurdle of being able to actually get these things built?
You mean for nuclear science in general?
Just spinning out of the industry and the products that get generated in reactors.
Right. So someone asked me a couple of weeks ago, what does 2050 look like? You get what you want, Tim, and we're at, pick a number, 80% nuclear, 20% renewables, 30% renewables, 70% whatever. My answer was, it doesn't have to look that different. The whole point with nuclear power is that it just quietly gets on with generating the power that we need for society to function, and we can all focus on other things. Some of the other pressing problems that we have in society. I'd quite like energy, as much as I love nuclear fission and nuclear science, I would quite like energy to be boring. I don't really want to be spending all this time fretting about energy and climate change when we have a solution there that can... We have a solution there that can solve.
I think hit more of the subsidiary industry. So you mentioned in the book nuclear medicine. You mentioned space travel.
Right. Okay. So obviously, like a large part of the book is about nuclear power because of the pressing energy issue. But that aside, there are all sorts of other interesting applications of nuclear science as well that I certainly wasn't aware of until like 5-10 years ago, and I started kind of reading about this and learning about it. One of them is nuclear medicine, which sounds like something from the future. is unbelievable is where we inject radioactive substances into people's bodies, but such that they preferentially attach to cancerous cells. And so you effectively make tumours radioactive using radioactive substances. And when those atoms decay and release their nuclear energy, they basically fry the tumour from the inside out, which is just amazing. I mean, it sounds like the last thing you would want to do is to inject radioactive substances into people's bodies. Radiophobia would have that to be like a complete no-no.
And just to be clear for the listeners at home, if you're not a trained physician, do not inject radioactive substances into your body.
I wouldn't recommend that. But there's a huge library of weird and wonderful isotopes out there that either are being used or could be used for diagnostics and curative medicine, particularly in curing cancer. We're using a few of them at the moment. So there are 50 million of these procedures performed worldwide every year. So it's already kind of a large part of the repertoire of medical science. But we're only just beginning to tap its true potential. And one of the things that's really tricky is getting your hands on these isotopes. You can't just buy actinium-225 from your local chemist. Don't attempt that. You would probably get put on some sort of list. I wouldn't recommend.
Or Amazon.
No, they will not
deliver.
Last time I checked, it wasn't on Amazon. One of the problems is getting these isotopes, and it's in part due to their shelf life. They're radioactive, and like all radioactive substances, they become less radioactive over time. So they have to be made on a continuous kind of just-in-time basis, which requires these really robust supply chains. They don't exist right now, actually, for most of these isotopes. And even for the isotopes where they do exist, the sources of these radioisotopes are very concentrated in a few facilities around the world that are aging rapidly. And so there's one of these reactors, one of these facilities in the Netherlands that supplies about 2/3 of Europe's medical isotopes, 2/3 of Europe's medical isotopes from a single point in the supply chain, and it's aging rapidly, and it will probably be switched off within the next 5 or 10 years, something like that. So these supply chains are incredibly vulnerable to...
And is Sellafield part of this network?
It's not at the moment, but one of the cool things about nuclear waste is that it's full of these weird isotopes that a lot of them we don't have any use for at the moment, but some of them we do have a use for, and some of them can be applied to these medical problems.
So this is really a resource, not a waste.
Definitely. So I make the argument in my book that nuclear waste is only waste if you waste it. It's actually very, very useful, and with a bit of kind of a lot of science and a lot of engineering and technology, but also a dash of creativity and kind of flair and kind of like sideways thinking and the kind of thinking outside the box, we can actually put this nuclear waste to use. Nuclear medicine is a really good example of that. Nuclear waste is actually quite a rich source of many of these medical isotopes. And it's not just medical applications as well as space applications. Beyond the orbit of, I mean, let's go extraterrestrial, right? If we're going to fix the energy problem, we may as well fix the solar system problem as well. Beyond the orbit of Jupiter, solar panels don't work very well because the sun is so dim, and so you need an alternate power source.
They're like Scotland, really.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. And one of the ways that you can do that, in fact, it's pretty much the only way you can do that, is with a radioactive power source. This is not a nuclear reactor. This is a radioactive lump of metal that is so radioactive that it's hot. And a device called a thermoelectric generator converts that heat into electricity. And there have been loads of spacecraft that have used this technology over the years. The Apollo astronauts took them to the moon. The Voyager probes, they took them into the outer solar system. Mars rovers, the Cassini probe around Saturn, New Horizons that explored Pluto. They've all been powered by these radioisotope power sources. And there's a really interesting element on the periodic table. It's element number 95, americium. And there's an isotope of americium that is pretty well suited to making these power sources. The problem is getting your hand on americium-241. It's like actinium-225. You can't buy it on Amazon. It turns out that nuclear waste is chock full of americium-241. And so by essentially mining, by chemically prying the americium from legacy nuclear waste, you could repurpose that material and fly it in space one day, not just for pure exploration purposes for the outer solar system, but also powering habitats on the surface of the moon and perhaps even Mars. And so not even the sky is the limit with nuclear waste. There are so many interesting uses for it, and who knows what we're going to use it for in the future.
So both these examples are fantastic. We've got a government who's got missions to improve innovation and industry in this country. So presumably they are opening the door to commercial exploitation of this waste.
Not right now, not commercial. It's still kind of in the early days of research and development and scaling this. A lot of this technology is new. Essentially, we've not really done it before. It's still in the kind of early R&D stage. And so if it does ever happen, we're still a while away from commercializing this technology. But maybe one day. I mean, just the plutonium in the UK, there's 140 tons of it. If you do the back of the envelope calculation, there's tons of americium-241 in that plutonium waste, which is essentially an infinite supply of fuel for nuclear space batteries. Wouldn't it be great if we used that for making space batteries and exploring the solar system?
And we got damn dare made real. Yeah.
Right, yeah, and maybe even helping humanity settle on the moon and not just survive there, but thrive there as well. These are the kinds of things that nuclear waste can enable.
Some of our politicians may need that habitat if things go the way they are.
Maybe.
So on that happy note, Tim, thank you very much. If you would like to read Tim's book, we're going to put a link to where you can purchase it in the show notes. Tim also has a website where you can read more about what he thinks and what he's been doing to explain nuclear power and technology in the longer term. And if you want to find out more about the future of energy or indeed any other IEA issues, then please read the IEA Substack, IEA Insider. Thank you very much.